You spent 4 hours assembling a bookshelf last weekend. The instructions were confusing. You stripped one screw. You had to redo an entire section because you put a panel in backwards. And when it was finally done, you stood back and thought, "This is the most beautiful bookshelf I have ever seen." Your friend came over. They glanced at it and said, "Nice shelf." You wanted to show them the joinery. You wanted to explain the cam locks. You wanted them to understand what you went through to build this thing. They had moved on to checking their phone before you even started. Here's the uncomfortable truth. That bookshelf is probably not objectively better than one a professional assembled. But to you, it feels like it is. And that feeling isn't irrational sentimentality. It's a documented psychological phenomenon. The Ikea effect. And once you understand it, you'll start seeing it everywhere. In your work, your relationships, and every half-finished project you can't bring yourself to throw away. In 2011, a team of researchers at Harvard Business School set out to study something that furniture companies had quietly known for decades. Michael Norton, Daniel Moshon, and Dan Ariely ran a series of experiments with a simple premise. Does building something yourself change how much you value it? In the first experiment, participants were given a flat-pack IKEA storage box and told to assemble it. Another group received an identical box that was already assembled. Then both groups were asked how much they'd be willing to pay for the box. The people who built it themselves were willing to pay 63% more for the exact same object. Not a little more. Nearly 2/3 more. Then Norton and his colleagues took it further. They ran the same test with origami. Participants folded simple paper cranes and frogs. No special skill required, no complex instructions. Afterward, the builders valued their origami figures almost as highly as pieces made by expert folders. They also assumed other people would value them just as much. They didn't. Outside observers rated the amateur origami as worth a fraction of what the builders expected. The builders couldn't see the gap. To them, the object's value was self-evident. Then came the most revealing test. Some participants were asked to build IKEA boxes, but were interrupted partway through and never allowed to finish. Their valuation of the incomplete object dropped dramatically. They didn't just value it less than the completed group. They valued it at roughly the same level as people who hadn't built anything at all. The effect wasn't simply about effort, it required completion. You had to finish the thing for the magic to work. So why does this happen? The answer lives in a concept psychologists call effort justification. Your brain runs a continuous cost-benefit calculation. When you pour time, energy, and frustration into something, your mind faces a problem. It can either admit that the effort wasn't worth it, or it can adjust its perception of the outcome to justify the cost. Admitting the effort wasn't worth it feels bad. It implies you made a poor decision, so instead, your brain quietly inflates your perception of what you produced. The output becomes more valuable, more meaningful, more beautiful, not because it changed, but because it needs to justify the input. This is the same mechanism behind hazing rituals, behind grueling initiation ceremonies at elite institutions, behind the feeling that a vacation you planned yourself for 6 months is somehow more satisfying than an identical trip a travel agent arranged in 20 minutes. The harder it was to get there, the better it has to have been. Your brain insists on it. Ariely connects this to something even more fundamental. When you make something, a piece of you goes into it. Not metaphorically, literally. Your decisions shaped it. Your hands touched it. Your problem solving is embedded in every joint and seam. The object becomes an extension of your identity in a way that a purchased object never can. This is why parents find their children's crayon drawings profound. Why chefs taste their own food differently than their customers do. Why founders consistently overvalue the companies they built. You are not evaluating the thing. You are evaluating yourself through the thing. Think about the last time you cooked a meal from scratch. Not something impressive, just pasta or a basic stir-fry. Did it taste slightly better than the same dish from a restaurant would have? Even if the restaurant's version was objectively superior, there was probably something about yours that felt more satisfying. That's the IKEA effect operating in the background. Your effort became an invisible ingredient. This is also why journaling works better than simply thinking through your problems. Why handwritten notes stick better than typed ones. Why a garden you tend yourself gives you something a professionally landscaped yard cannot. The participation changes the product. but only in your perception of it. And here's where it gets complicated. Because the IKEA effect is not always an error. Sometimes the thing you made really is better. Building the shelf forced you to understand every component. Cooking the meal forced you to understand the recipe. Writing the code yourself forced you to understand the architecture. The effort created genuine knowledge and genuine ownership that a purchased solution couldn't have provided. The bias only becomes a problem when you can't tell the difference. When you cling to an inferior solution because you built it. When you reject outside help because accepting it would diminish your sense of authorship. When you overcharge for your work because the hours you logged feel like they should be visible in the price. Norton and his colleagues explored exactly this failure mode. They found that the IKEA effect disappears almost completely under one condition: when the builder is given a chance to inspect comparable work made by others before estimating value. When people saw what similar objects actually look like when made by professionals, the inflation collapsed. They could suddenly perceive the gap between what they made and what was possible. The implication is striking. The IKEA effect is largely a comparison problem. We overvalue our own creations not because we're foolish, but because we typically evaluate them in isolation. Your bookshelf sits in your living room. You don't walk past 50 other bookshelves every day reminding you of what skilled craftsmanship actually looks like. This is one of the reasons creative professionals struggle with their own work in ways amateurs don't. A professional designer has seen so much excellent design that they can see exactly where their own work falls short. An amateur, evaluating their work without that reference library, may genuinely believe they've produced something remarkable. Ignorance of the standard protects the feeling. Knowledge of the standard destroys it. In 2012, researchers extended the original findings to examine how the IKEA effect plays out in collaborative settings. They found something that should matter to anyone who works in a team. When people contributed to a group project, they consistently believed their own contributions were more valuable than their teammates' contributions, even when outside observers rated the contributions as roughly equal. Each person experienced the IKEA effect on their own portion of the work, without experiencing it on anyone else's. This is a recipe for resentment. For the engineer who thinks the designers are just making things pretty. For the designer who thinks the engineers just build what they're told. For every team where each member quietly believes they're carrying more weight than they're being given credit for. It's not ego, necessarily. It's just the IKEA effect distributed across a group of people who each built their own shelf. So what do you do with this? First, recognize where the effect is inflating your judgment. Before you reject a collaborator's idea, ask whether you'd evaluate it differently if you had thought of it yourself. Before you insist your approach is better, ask whether the hours you've already spent on it are affecting your objectivity. Before you price your work, ask what an outside observer with no knowledge of your effort would say it's worth. The effort you put in is real. The time was real. The frustration was real. But none of that changes the quality of the output. Those are two separate ledgers, and your brain desperately wants to merge them. Second, use the effect deliberately. When you need to care about something, a project, a habit, a relationship, find ways to build it yourself rather than simply receiving it. Customize the plan instead of following a template. Contribute to the solution instead of inheriting it. The ownership you manufacture through participation will make you more committed, more resilient when things get hard, and more invested in making it succeed. IKEA, it turns out, stumbled onto something profound entirely by accident. By forcing customers to do the work themselves, they created an army of people who genuinely loved their flat-pack furniture. Not because the furniture was excellent, because the customers made it theirs. Every startup that lets users customize their experience is exploiting this. Every curriculum that emphasizes project-based learning is exploiting this. Every fitness program built around tracking and logging is exploiting this. Effort creates attachment. Attachment creates persistence. Persistence creates results. The IKEA effect is not a flaw to be eliminated. It's a feature of how human beings construct meaning. We are not passive consumers of our environment. We are builders, and building something, even something small, even something imperfect, is one of the oldest ways we have of saying, I was here. This was mine. I made this. The research doesn't tell you to stop loving the things you built. It tells you to notice when that love is distorting your judgment. And then, when the stakes don't require perfect objectivity. When you're standing in your living room on a Sunday evening, looking at a slightly crooked bookshelf you spent 4 hours assembling, it tells you that the feeling you have is real, even if the object doesn't quite deserve it. You built it. Of course it's beautiful. That's just how it works.